In the spring of 1453 AD, the Roman Empire was not fighting for glory on the open fields of Italy, but bleeding to death behind the towering fortifications of Constantinople. Here, a desperate, exhausted garrison of barely 7,000 Christian defenders stood on the ramparts, staring down a highly disciplined Ottoman army of over 80,000 men. The morning air carried a physical warning before the strike, marked by the deep, rhythmic vibration of massive artillery trembling through the ancient stone under the defenders' boots. This siege represented the ultimate military paradox of its era. For a millennium, the legendary Theodosian walls had stood as an impenetrable barrier, surviving devastating earthquakes, relentless plagues, and the full weight of countless invading armies. They were considered the absolute pinnacle of defensive architecture, securing a permanent geographical lock between East and West. Yet, in a matter of weeks, this thousand-year-old shield was about to be rendered completely obsolete. It would be systematically shattered by an engineering nightmare that permanently changed the mechanics of global warfare. The men on the walls were not merely fighting a vast army. They were facing the violent dawn of the Gunpowder Age. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the relentless siege logistics, the brilliant and unorthodox tactical maneuvers, and the fatal command failure that finally brought down the Roman Empire. By 1453 AD, the title of Roman Empire was a geopolitical fiction. The colossal superpower that had once stretched from the mist-shrouded forests of Britain to the scorching deserts of Syria had been violently dismantled over centuries of relentless attrition. What remained of imperial authority was effectively reduced to the city of Constantinople itself and a few scattered, vulnerable holdings in the Peloponnese. Inside the once magnificent capital, the decay was impossible to hide. Behind the massive fortifications, entire districts lay half-empty and overgrown with wild vines, with livestock grazing quietly amidst the crumbling, weather-beaten ruins of abandoned marble forums. It was a stark, physical manifestation of a dying state. The imperial government was completely bankrupt. Having permanently lost the fertile agricultural plains and lucrative trade hubs of Anatolia, the treasury was entirely starved of the revenue required to sustain a professional standing army. Without taxable land or a functioning agrarian economy, Emperor Constantine XI inherited a military apparatus that existed mostly on parchment. The demographic collapse was absolute. Constantinople, which had once boasted a population of 500,000 citizens at its zenith, now held roughly 50,000 isolated souls. Consequently, the defense of the capital relied entirely on a fractured coalition of foreign mercenaries, naval contingents, and untrained civilian volunteers. Beyond the immediate shadow of the Theodosian walls, the strategic map was exceptionally bleak. Every overland road, every vital mountain pass, and nearly every adjacent waterway was now firmly controlled by the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. Constantine was essentially the ruler of a heavily fortified island, slowly drowning in a hostile sea. The only logical lifeline for the survival of the imperial government lay to the west, with the Catholic kingdoms and maritime republics of Europe. However, in the 15th century, military alliances were inextricably bound to theology. The bitter religious schism between the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople and the Catholic papacy in Rome had fostered centuries of deep-seated mutual hatred. This animosity was permanently scarred into the Byzantine psyche by the brutal Western sack of their city during the Fourth Crusade. Desperate to secure military reinforcements, Constantine I made the deeply unpopular political calculation to officially submit his church to papal authority. This diplomatic maneuver triggered absolute outrage within his own borders. The Orthodox clergy and the populace fiercely rejected the union, famously declaring they would rather see the Ottoman turban ruling the city than the Catholic mitre. Consequently, the promised grand crusading armies of Europe never materialized. The West sent only a trickle of independent Genoese and Venetian mercenaries, leaving the imperial capital profoundly and fatally isolated, while the emperor dispatched frantic envoys across the Mediterranean, begging foreign courts for naval salvation. His time had already expired. Just beyond the horizon, a young, relentlessly ambitious Ottoman sovereign had consolidated his grip on his empire, and he was already silently calculating the exact thickness of the ancient Roman walls. The architect of this impending destruction, Sultan Mehmed II, was a 21-year-old monarch who understood that his political legitimacy depended entirely on the capture of the Byzantine capital. His previous brief stint on the throne had been marred by insubordination and political maneuvering by powerful viziers. To permanently silence his domestic rivals and cement his absolute authority, he mobilized an imperial juggernaut rather than a mere raiding party. Surrounding the city by land was a highly organized Ottoman war machine, consisting of over 80,000 regular troops. At the core of this massive host stood the Janissaries, an elite, heavily armored infantry corps fiercely loyal to the Sultan and renowned for their unbreakable battlefield discipline. The Ottoman encampment stretching outside the walls was a marvel of logistical precision. Tents were aligned in strict geometric grids. Secure supply lines brought constant provisions from Anatolia and Thrace, and a profound, ordered discipline characterized the gathering of tens of thousands of men awaiting their sovereign's command. Opposing this colossal apparatus was a desperate, improvised coalition holding the ramparts. Emperor Constantine I commanded a fractured force of roughly 7,000 men, an agonizingly small number tasked with defending miles of complex fortifications. Recognizing the impossibility of the situation, the emperor handed tactical control of the land walls to Giovanni Giustiniani, a renowned Genoese mercenary and expert in siege warfare. Giustiniani had voluntarily sailed into the doomed city with 700 heavily armed professional soldiers, providing a critical spine of veteran discipline to the crumbling defense. He immediately set to work, analyzing the structural vulnerabilities of the Theodosian walls, directing his men to reinforce the weakest sectors, particularly where centuries of neglect had left the outer defenses compromised. Yet, forging a unified command structure from the remaining troops proved to be a daily, grinding tactical challenge. The defensive perimeter was marked by the chaotic clatter of mismatched armor and the rapid shouting of overlapping languages as Venetian sailors, Genoese mercenaries, and native Greek militia scrambled to form a cohesive line along the ancient parapets. Rivalries between the proud Italian city-states ran deep, and Giustiniani had to assert brutal operational authority just to ensure the gates were properly manned and orders were executed without deadly hesitation. The disparity in military strength was absolute, with the defenders outnumbered by more than 10 to 1. In any conventional theater of war, the sheer kinetic weight of the Ottoman infantry would have crushed the Byzantine lines in a matter of hours. However, Sultan Mehmed II possessed a brilliant, calculating military mind. He recognized that the Theodosian walls had been designed precisely to neutralize numerical superiority, creating a geographical choke point that no amount of human flesh could simply overrun. The Sultan knew that sending his regular infantry against the towering stone fortifications would only result in a senseless slaughter. To secure his ultimate prize, Mehmed realized he could not rely on traditional tactics. He had to fundamentally change the very mechanics of siege warfare. To dismantle the defenses, Sultan Mehmed II first had to ensure that the city could not survive a prolonged war of attrition. In 1452 AD, a full year before the formal siege began, he ordered the rapid construction of a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus Strait. Known as Rumeli Hisari, or the Throat Cutter, this fortification was an absolute strategic choke point. By commanding the narrowest span of the waterway, Ottoman artillery effectively severed Constantinople's critical maritime supply lines to the Black Sea. Any Genoese or Venetian merchant vessel attempting to smuggle grain to the starving Byzantine capital faced immediate destruction from shore batteries. The city was now geographically locked, slowly starving behind its own walls, entirely isolated from the vital agricultural yields of the northern trade routes. With the maritime lifeline severed, Mehmed turned his full attention to the impenetrable stone of the Theodosian walls. The tactical solution arrived in the form of a brilliant, pragmatic Hungarian engineer named Orban. Originally offering his specialized services to Emperor Constantine II, Orban was ultimately turned away. The bankrupt Byzantine treasury could not afford his exorbitant fees, nor did the city possess the raw materials required for his ambitious designs. Mehmed, conversely, wielded the vast resources of an expanding empire and immediately funded Orban to cast a siege weapon of unprecedented, terrifying scale. The result was the Basilica Cannon, a colossal bronze bombard designed to fire solid stone projectiles weighing over 1,000 pounds, generating a kinetic impact mathematically calculated to shatter solid Roman masonry. The creation of the weapon was a masterpiece of metallurgical engineering, but deploying it was a monumental logistical nightmare that tested the discipline of the Ottoman war machine. The massive bronze barrel had to be transported from the foundries in Edirne across the undulating landscape of Thrace to the Byzantine capital. It required a sprawling, slow-moving convoy, pulled by a team of 60 heavily yoked oxen and flanked by hundreds of laborers tasked with constantly leveling the terrain and building temporary wooden bridges ahead of the load. The grinding, metallic screech of the colossal bronze barrel shifting on its reinforced wooden wagons echoed for miles as it was hauled inch by agonizing inch over the rough dirt roads. This crawling procession took weeks to navigate a distance a cavalry unit could cover in mere days, but the Sultan possessed the strategic patience necessary to execute his blueprint for conquest. Upon its arrival outside the city gates, the massive bombard was painstakingly maneuvered into firing position, requiring immense wooden platforms to absorb the violent recoil of the gunpowder blast. As the massive gun was finally aligned with the ancient fortifications, the defenders looking down from the parapets realized a terrifying truth. Their 1,000-year-old stone shield was suddenly obsolete. In early April 1453 AD, the systematic dismantling of Constantinople commenced. The Ottoman artillery batteries, anchored by Orban's colossal bronze bombard, opened a relentless barrage against the land walls. This was not a traditional medieval siege, but an industrial-scale bombardment that fundamentally altered the rhythm of warfare. The massive super cannon could only be fired a few times a day due to the intense heat and the hours required to cool the bronze barrel with olive oil, but its impact was catastrophic. The sheer kinetic shockwave of the 1,000-pound stone spheres striking the ancient masonry caused entire sections of the outer wall to completely collapse. A dense, suffocating cloud of sulfur and pulverized limestone dust quickly enveloped the perimeter, hanging permanently over the city and severely reducing visibility for the defenders stationed on the ramparts. However, the rigid stone that shattered so easily under the force of gunpowder was rapidly replaced by a highly adaptable defense. Commander Giovanni Giustiniani recognized immediately that brittle medieval masonry could not withstand the kinetic energy of modern artillery. Instead of wasting time attempting to rebuild the stone walls, he directed his 700 professional soldiers to oversee a massive civilian mobilization. Men, women, and monks worked feverishly under the cover of darkness to plug the gaping breaches with makeshift earthworks. They drove heavy wooden stakes into the ground and piled up barrels of sand, loose rubble, and packed dirt to create deep sloped barricades. This softer, flexible material absorbed the impact of the stone projectiles far better than rigid limestone. When an Ottoman cannonball struck the earthworks, it sank harmlessly into the packed dirt rather than shattering the defense. Giustiniani effectively transformed a technological mismatch into a grueling daily war of attrition, forcing the Ottoman gunners to constantly reposition their batteries to target new structural weaknesses. While the land walls endured this agonizing daily punishment, the northern maritime flank of the city remained an impenetrable fortress. The Golden Horn, the deep-water inlet protecting Constantinople's older and significantly weaker sea walls, was physically sealed off by a massive forged iron chain. Stretched taut across the water from the city, directly to the neutral Genoese colony of Galata, this heavy boom presented an absolute barrier to the Ottoman navy. Sultan Mehmed II commanded a fleet of well over 100 vessels, but his admirals repeatedly failed to breach the chain. The heavy iron links prevented the Ottoman galleys from entering the harbor, ensuring that Emperor Constantine VII did not have to divert his critically limited force of 7,000 men away from the desperate fighting on the land walls. The tactical frustration of the Ottoman command was compounded on April 20, when a small flotilla of 4 heavily armed Christian merchant ships successfully fought their way through the entire Ottoman blockade. Utilizing their higher decks and superior naval discipline, they battered the surrounding Ottoman galleys and slipped safely over the boom into the Golden Horn, bringing a crucial, albeit small, infusion of grain and supplies. By the end of April, a rigid tactical stalemate had settled over the operation. The earthworks absorbed the artillery, and the iron chain held the harbor secure. Emperor Constantine II began to cautiously believe that as long as the Golden Horn remained physically protected, the garrison could endure until a European relief force finally arrived. But he fundamentally underestimated the ruthless pragmatism of his adversary. Sultan Mehmed II realized he could not break the iron chain from the water, so he prepared to execute a logistical maneuver that would completely rewrite the established rules of naval warfare. The Sultan understood that the geometry of the siege was heavily tilted against him as long as the Byzantine northern flank remained untouchable. If his galleys could not sail through the waters of the Golden Horn, they would have to sail over the land. Mehmed ordered his engineers to execute a logistical maneuver that defied conventional military doctrine, constructing a makeshift wooden tramway over the steep, rugged hills directly behind the neutral Genoese colony of Galata. Under the strict cover of darkness, thousands of Ottoman laborers hastily leveled the uneven terrain, laying down a mile-long track of heavy timber rollers. The night air carried the groaning of stressed wood and the sharp, heavy scent of rendered animal fat, which was slathered across the tracks in massive quantities to reduce the immense friction of the crossing. On the morning of April 22, the Byzantine sentries looking out over the harbor witnessed a logistical impossibility. Driven by teams of oxen and the sheer synchronized muscular force of the Ottoman infantry, a fleet of roughly 70 fully rigged galleys and transport ships was hauled up the incline, dragged across the crest of the Galata Hill, and eased down into the previously safe waters of the Golden Horn. The ships had been transported with their sails unfurled and oarsmen keeping time, a psychological display of supreme imperial power. Mehmed had successfully outflanked the massive iron chain without ever striking a blow against it. By inserting his naval squadron directly behind the primary coastal defense, the Sultan instantly neutralized the greatest geographical advantage the imperial capital possessed. Furthermore, the Ottoman engineers quickly utilized the ships to establish a solid pontoon bridge across the water, allowing troops and artillery batteries to move seamlessly between the primary siege camp and the northern shore. The strategic consequence of this overland naval deployment was immediate, profound, and devastating for the Byzantine command structure. For weeks, Emperor Constantine XI and Commander Giustiniani had relied on the absolute security of the sea walls, a luxury that allowed them to concentrate their critically limited force of 7,000 men along the heavily battered landward fortifications. Now, a completely new and highly vulnerable front had violently opened to the north. The emperor was forced into a desperate, zero-sum tactical calculus. To prevent an imminent amphibious assault from the newly arrived Ottoman fleet, he had to systematically strip vital troops, archers, and light artillery from the Lycus River valley, the exact sector currently disintegrating under Orban's daily bombardments, and redeploy them along several miles of fragile, undermanned sea walls. The mathematical reality of the Byzantine defense had finally collapsed. A garrison of 7,000 soldiers simply could not physically hold 14 miles of perimeter against a synchronized multi-axis assault from an army of 80,000. Giustiniani's Italian mercenaries and the local Greek militia were profoundly exhausted, fighting in continuous shifts without relief, sprinting from breach to breach across a city that was rapidly running out of food, structural materials, and time. The Ottoman encirclement was now absolute, wrapping the capital in a tightening, inescapable vise of naval blockades and relentless artillery fire. With the defending forces dangerously thinned out and stretched to their absolute physical and psychological breaking point, the commanders, standing on the crumbling ramparts, knew with terrifying certainty that it would only take one compromised gate to doom the entire Roman Empire. In the pre-dawn hours of the 29th of May, 1453 AD, Sultan Mehmed II initiated the final, decisive assault on the Byzantine capital. Recognizing that the garrison was critically exhausted and stretched across miles of compromised fortifications, the Ottoman command executed a methodical wave attack designed to drain the last reserves of the defenders' stamina. The primary tactical focus was the Lycus River Valley. Here, the natural depression of the terrain meant the Theodosian walls were built at a lower elevation, and weeks of concentrated artillery fire had reduced the outer barriers to pulverized rubble. Mehmed sent his irregular troops forward first, absorbing the initial volleys of Byzantine arrows and crossbows. This was a calculated sacrifice of low-tier infantry, utilized specifically to exhaust the defenders' limited ammunition and muscular energy before the true strike arrived. As the sun rose over the Bosphorus, the Ottoman regular infantry followed, pressing hard against the makeshift earthworks. Yet, despite the overwhelming numerical disparity, Commander Giovanni Giustiniani and his corps of 700 Genoese mercenaries maintained absolute structural discipline. Fighting in the narrow, choked space between the ruined outer wall and the intact inner wall, the Italian heavy infantry utilized their superior armor and close-quarters cohesion to repeatedly repel the Ottoman surges. The Lycus Valley devolved into a rigid tactical stalemate. Sensing the momentum stalling, Mehmed committed his ultimate strategic reserve, the Janissaries. These elite, heavily armored shock troops advanced in perfect, unbroken formation, launching a synchronized assault against the very center of the Byzantine defensive line. It was in this desperate, tightly packed engagement that the geometry of the defense fundamentally fractured. A projectile historians debate whether it was an Ottoman crossbow bolt or a lead shot from an early hand cannon penetrated Giustiniani's armor, striking him severely in the chest or shoulder. The physical wound was devastating, but the psychological impact was fatal to the entire Byzantine command structure. Racked by immense pain and severe blood loss, the Genoese commander ordered his men to unlock one of the secure inner gates so he could be evacuated to a ship for medical treatment. Emperor Constantine VI, commanding a sector nearby, recognized the disastrous optical effect this would have and pleaded with Giustiniani to remain at his post to anchor the line. But the mercenary commander's resolve had broken. As the inner gate swung open to carry him away, the sight of their invincible leader retreating stripped the remaining Italian soldiers of their fighting will. Without Giustiniani's iron discipline, the fragile coalition of foreign mercenaries and local militia instantly evaporated. Panic is highly contagious in a confined siege environment. The Genoese soldiers abandoned their barricades and surged toward the open evacuation gate, desperate to reach the safety of the harbor. A sudden, terrifying silence fell over the remaining Byzantine commanders as they realized the center had completely hollowed out, a silence abruptly shattered by the triumphant blare of Ottoman war horns as the first Janissaries crested the undefended earthworks. Compounding this centralized collapse was a catastrophic operational error on the northern flank. In the chaos of the shifting lines, a small postern gate known as the Kirkoporta had been left unlocked following a Byzantine sortie. Ottoman vanguard units discovered the unsecured entrance, slipped through the ancient defenses, and rapidly scaled the inner ramparts to raise the Sultan's banner over the city. With the Ottoman standard flying above the Kirkoporta and thousands of Janissaries pouring unchecked through the shattered Lycus Valley, the strategic reality was absolute. The 1,000-year-old fortifications had finally been bypassed, and the streets of the imperial capital lay completely exposed to an army of 80,000 men. As the organized defensive line dissolved into chaotic, localized pockets of resistance, Emperor Constantine XI stood amidst the collapsing ruins of his empire, facing a final, impossible choice between immediate surrender and total annihilation. Refusing to flee and survive the death of his capital, he made a final, grim calculation of martial honor. Systematically stripping off his purple imperial regalia and any ornate insignia that marked him as a sovereign, he drew his sword and led his remaining loyal guards into the chaotic, surging melee of the advancing Janissaries. In the sheer, brutal crush of close-quarters combat, the last Roman emperor vanished into history. His body was lost amidst the thousands of fallen soldiers, never to be definitively identified by either the victorious Ottomans or the surviving Greeks. The political entity that had traced its unbroken lineage back to Augustus Caesar effectively died in that anonymous, desperate clash of iron. With the central command structure erased, the city formally collapsed. According to the strict military customs of 15th century warfare, a city that refused terms of surrender and was ultimately taken by storm was subjected to a customary 3-day sack. Ottoman troops fanned out systematically across the sprawling capital, securing high-value prisoners for ransom and seizing the accumulated wealth of centuries. Monasteries and churches were methodically stripped of their golden reliquaries, and thousands of citizens who had sought refuge in the deepest sanctuaries were taken as captives. Yet, this was not a mindless, uncontrolled annihilation driven by pure bloodlust. It was a highly structured, pragmatic transfer of wealth and human capital, executed by a disciplined imperial army claiming the legitimate spoils of a gruelingly hard-fought military campaign. On the afternoon of May 29, Sultan Mehmed II rode through the Carisius Gate, quietly surveying the conquered metropolis. He had finally won the ultimate strategic prize, but he did not intend to rule over a smoking, depopulated wasteland. Recognizing that excessive destruction would permanently ruin his future center of power, he quickly reasserted his supreme authority, ordering his military police to halt the looting early to preserve the vital civic infrastructure. Accompanied by his senior viziers, the young sultan directed his procession straight to the architectural and spiritual heart of the fallen empire, the Hagia Sophia. Dismounting at the grand entrance, he stepped into the massive basilica. The heavy echo of his boots striking the ancient marble floors permanently replaced a millennium of Christian chanting. He immediately ordered an attending imam to ascend the pulpit and proclaim the Islamic creed, formally converting the great cathedral into a mosque and officially declaring Constantinople the new, permanent capital of the Ottoman Empire. The geopolitical map of the Mediterranean had been fundamentally redrawn in a single afternoon. The vital strategic choke point, bridging Europe and Asia, was now firmly consolidated under Ottoman authority, granting them an absolute monopoly over the Black Sea trade routes and cementing Mehmed II, now forever known as the Conqueror, as an undisputed global power. But while the physical Roman Empire was dead, the seismic shockwave of its destruction was about to violently wake Western Europe. When the news of Constantinople's fall reached the courts of Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, the immediate reaction was sheer, paralyzing terror. But the collapse of the Byzantine state triggered a profound cultural and economic chain reaction that would ultimately dismantle the medieval world. The first major consequence was a massive intellectual hemorrhage. In the months and years surrounding the siege, a steady stream of Greek scholars, theologians, and linguists fled the ruined capital and migrated westward, seeking sanctuary in the wealthy city-states of Italy. They brought with them centuries of preserved manuscripts containing ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature that had been largely lost or forgotten in the West. This sudden influx of classical knowledge poured directly into the intellectual vacuum of Europe, serving as a vital catalyst for the Renaissance and fundamentally altering the cultural trajectory of the continent. While Italy absorbed the intellectual wealth of the fallen empire, the rest of Western Europe found itself abruptly cut off from its material wealth. By securing Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II did not merely conquer a city, he gained absolute administrative control over the Bosphorus Strait. This geopolitical lock effectively closed the Black Sea to hostile shipping and monopolized the crucial terrestrial trade corridors linking Europe to the lucrative markets of Asia. The traditional Silk Road was now firmly under Ottoman regulation. Spices, silk, and essential Eastern commodities were suddenly subjected to heavy imperial taxation, severely crippling the profit margins of Western merchants and suffocating the economic engines that had driven the Mediterranean for centuries. This intense, unavoidable economic pressure forced a radical shift in global strategy. The kingdoms of Western Europe, particularly the rising maritime powers of Portugal and Spain, realized they could no longer rely on the eastern land routes to sustain their economies. Driven by the absolute necessity to bypass the Ottoman monopoly, European monarchs began funding unprecedented naval expeditions into the uncharted expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The fall of the Byzantine capital directly incentivized maritime explorers to navigate around the southern tip of Africa, and within a few decades, drove subsequent expeditions to sail blindly westward across the Atlantic in search of a new route to India. The artillery fire that shattered the Roman walls in 1453 AD did not just end an ancient empire. It inadvertently launched the Age of Discovery, forcing Europe to conquer the oceans and ultimately drawing the blueprint for the modern global map. The siege of Constantinople remains the ultimate historical pivot point, marking the violent, definitive close of the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire was permanently buried beneath the rubble of the Theodosian walls. but the geopolitical shock of its destruction created the geopolitical realities of the modern world. Please subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together and join us for the next chapter of World Chronicles.